Wisdom Download podcast, a podcast series where we interview leaders from around the world and they share their wisdom of what they have learned in life. And today on the podcast, we have Richard Beaumont from Melbourne in Australia. Welcome, Richard, to the Wisdom Download podcast.
Thanks, Tommy. Nice to be with everybody and chatting in this way.
Thank you, Richard. Perhaps you would tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about your background in life, Richard, and your early part of your journey.
Happy to, Tommy. It's good to meet everybody and talk. I live in Melbourne in Australia. We've just finished 77 days of lockdown, which was a 5-day snap one 77 days ago. So we'll be out of our cages by Friday. That has its own challenges. I didn't always live in Australia. I started out life in New Zealand, in Christchurch, where they had the major earthquake about 14 years ago. A beautiful part of the world, a very quaint little city of 330,000 people. I say to people that I was going to church for 9 months before I was even born. So my mother was taking me to church in utero. And so I was raised, and I'm so grateful, I was raised in a Christian family. My parents both loved the Lord. They were strong Christians. They entertained relentlessly. They had missionaries through their home. Any major speaker that came to our church from overseas would end up staying at the Beaumonts. And we would be subject to some really interesting people. And also, I have to confess, quite a few boring ones as well. But my parents always had an open home. We lived in a large English-designed home. And there was always 12 places set for family lunch on a Sunday. So my parents would cook a huge roast meal. Mum would do 3 desserts along with a bowl of whipped cream. And there'd be 6 of us and 6 seats available for whoever was available who was visiting church. And the students would line up and make close friends with my parents, because if there weren't enough visitors to fill the 6 seats, the next level was to invite students who were at the local university. So my dad was renowned for quizzing them, checking their theology, throwing the odd verbal hand grenade into the room just to see what they were made of, push them, test them, ask them hard questions, and sometimes bend them in little knots because they couldn't figure it out. And this was his way of mentoring and discipling and stretching. And of course, we got caught, me and my 3 brothers, we got caught in the vortex of that, which was a delight, actually. And it taught me to think and to reason and to argue and to debate in the best sense of that. So just don't take things at face value. Think them through, and don't take everything you're told the first time. So that was interesting. I started out working in a newspaper office so I had a private school education, which was a real blessing, really high quality education. I think I spent too much time with my surfboard down at the beach and not enough time in school, but that's another conversation. I didn't go to university. I've got no formal education. About 5 to 10% of people when I left high school went to university. Now it's about 95% of people, or 90% would go to university, and it's the opposite here in Australia. But I started working for a newspaper office, and I got a job selling display advertising. And I was working with a territory. I remember looking at a guy in my office who, after I'd been there 6 months, decided to retire at 65. He'd been doing the same job for 30 years, and I thought, wow, I never want to end up like him in the same job for 30 years. I'm doing this at 18. Do I still want to be doing it at 65? But my dad was in business. He had a number of businesses, classic entrepreneur, a string of grocery stores, a string of cafes and restaurants. He was just an interesting character, quite well known around the town, an interesting person. He stretched me, he pushed me. One day he said to me, "Richard, what would your what would you like to have? What would your goal be in life? And I said, you know what? I really want a red MG. He said, well, you can have one. If that's what you want, you can have one. I said, oh, wow, thank you. When are you going to buy me it? He said, I'm not buying it for you. He said, if you want a red MG, you can have a red MG. But he said, you'll have to get rid of that girlfriend you've got, stop taking her out for dinner and wasting money on movies. You'll get a second job. You'll save hard. You won't spend any money on yourself. And one day you'll have enough money to buy a red MG. So if that's your goal in life, you go for it. You can have a red MG. And it sort of popped my bubble in a way, because I thought, it's true, I can have whatever I want if I'm prepared to make the sacrifice to get it. But we were raised in a youth group. We had great mentors there, people who, they weren't probably the best and the best Bible teachers on the planet, but boy, they had a heart for us, and they loved us, and they cared for us, and they showed God's love to us. And that was formational. And I've gone back to a couple of them since and said, thank you so much for those Bible classes, for running the youth group, and for yelling at us for an hour and a half because we didn't do the right thing. But we knew you loved us, and we appreciated that. And we saw God working through you. So I had a lot of theology and a lot of training in a good Bible-based church. And for that, I'm so grateful, Tommy. And when we got married. I got married the day before I turned 21. It was the girl I was dating when my dad told me to get rid of her if I wanted an MG.
So no MG, Richard?
Well, actually, the truth is I did buy a red MG, and it was a bit of a cathartic moment for me, because I was able to afford a red MG when my mother passed away, and we received a family inheritance. And I had this money that I had that was spare money. It was disposable money. And I actually chose at that point in my life to buy a red MG to celebrate my parents and to have some fun with my kids. And we restored it. And it was a neighborhood sort of attraction. And I ran it for a couple of years and thought, I don't need a red MG, and I got rid of it. But sadly, I was able to purchase one, but only on the death of my mother. My dad had died earlier with cancer. So, it was one of those aha moments, but I'm glad I did. And I can say I owned a red MG.
Wow. You got married at 21, Richard, or almost 21. Did you continue in advertising, or did you find a different career path? I
ended up becoming a photographer, actually, and I took kids' portraits in shopping centres, and was quite good at it. I loved doing photography, and I did these professional portraits which were sold to their parents. And the reason I joined this photography company is because they were looking for staff for Australia, and they were recruiting New Zealanders to go to Australia to do photography for them. And I knew that if I got a job in New Zealand to work for them, and I waited long enough, they'd transfer me to Australia. So Julie and I decided that we wanted to go live in Melbourne, because I had a brother here and Julie had a sister here. And so we came to Melbourne, and I did this photography for a while. Then I got a job as a sales representative selling very expensive Swedish handmade crystal called Orifors, and Bing & Grondell Danish porcelain, and Royal Worcester bone china to retailers as a representative for the importer. And I did that for several years and enjoyed it. It was only then that we were running the youth group in our local church. We were skiing in the winter, and we had a catamaran. We were sailing in the summer, and the lifestyle was great in Australia. My wife is a nurse, so we were what the advertisers called DINKS at the time. It stood for double income, no kids, so high disposable income. And we had a really great lifestyle, running the youth group, walking with the Lord, mentoring and discipling young people. And it was through the youth group that we heard about a ship called the Logos, which visited Melbourne in 1980, I think it would have been. And we didn't get to see it. We were busy that weekend, but the youth group went. And then a friend of ours who was in our small group said, if you really want to be a good Christian, you should join that organisation called Operation Mobilisation, or OM, as it's known today. And so we decided that we would apply for this to join this organisation, and that we were going to give God 2 years of our lives. And we hoped he appreciated it, because, boy, we were giving up quite a lot to do this. it was probably 3 months in that we got accepted. 3 months on the ship. Our cabin was 3 meters long and 2 meters wide. We were living with 135 others from 23 different countries. There was no privacy.
Goodness.
Young married couple. And 3 months in, my wife did a little dummy split. And she said, I can't handle this anymore. I want to go home. So we went to the leadership and said, you know what, we're really struggling with this. They sent us off for a weekend. We were in India at the time. We went to Goa in India. We had 3 days by ourselves. We regrouped. We prayed. We asked God to give us the strength to see it through. And we ended up living on the Logos and the Doulos for the next 6 years.
6 years?
So we went from Singapore up to northern Sweden, through the Middle East and through the Med, around India. And then we joined the Doulos in the UK. And then we went circumnavigated Africa and ended up back in Thailand. So our son Matthew was born in England, in Sunderland. He's a Geordie man. He speaks like this. He goes, why, aye, how you going? All right. Did you bring the bands and the hinny? Matthew we joined the ship when he was 2 weeks old. And Matthew had been in 24 countries before he turned 2. I don't think there's many people that have done that. He does say he doesn't remember a lot of them.
No, I doubt if he does. God bless Matthew.
And our second son, Philip, was born in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia when we were living there doing advanced prep for the ship. Went there with Julie 7 months pregnant, no visa, turned up, got given a house, got loaned a car, opened a little office, arranged for the ship visit to Kuala Lumpur, a Christian ship in a strongly Muslim nation. And God just opened up doors that you could never imagine would have happened. We didn't know where the money was coming from to pay the hospital bill. A maiden aunt of my mother's heard that Julie was having a baby in Kuala Lumpur. She'd never given us any money. We had no money. And the money she sent in New Zealand dollars translated to within 5 ringgit, which is about £1, of the cost of that hospital bed and what the medical costs were.
Goodness.
One gift, and that was it. She's never given since.
Wow.
So we've seen God's provision so many times in such diverse circumstances that there's no doubt in our minds of God's provision. When we put our lives on the line, literally, and we lay ourselves before him and ask him to provide for what we need.
Excellent. Richard, you've already talked quite a lot about Christianity and faith, but what would you say have been the role that faith has played in your life and leadership over 40 plus years of ministry and business and all of that?
You can never guess, but I would say without my faith, I'm sure my life would have been a complete train wreck. I would probably be on my 3rd marriage. I would have probably made and lost a couple of fortunes. I may not even be alive, but I have to say that from putting my faith in Christ when I was 14 years of age, and living that life or seeking to follow Jesus my entire life, it was foundational for me. Everything in my life has been built upon that foundation of faith. It doesn't mean I've done it right every time. It doesn't mean haven't tried to take control of my life and do it my way. But every time I've come back to that faith and back to that foundation and realized that if I seek God, if I serve him, if my goal is to obey and do what it is that he wants me to do, regardless of what it costs, then I can't live a better life. And that's been our experience. We've had some hard times. Julie had a couple of miscarriages when we were away living on these ships. I've had guns pointed at my head. I've been accused of drug smuggling. I've been in all sorts of sticky situations. I've been to 85 countries around the world, Tommy, and some of them I've been to 10 or 15 or 20 times. And I've ministered,
Good.
had the chance to share the love of Christ in probably nearly every one of those 85 countries. It doesn't make me better or special. It just means that when we open our lives to do what God wants us to do, that he gives us opportunities that you could never imagine you would have the chance to do that. So my faith is foundational to every single thing that I do. When I was in business, it waxed and waned a bit, but for the whole of that time, when I left OM after 18 years, having been a missioner for 18 years and was the Australian director for OM for 10 of those years, went to work with a Christian friend in a very secular business. I went to join a .com company about 6 months before the international .com crash. And we went from the 45th floor of this building in Collins Street in Melbourne. And I think I rode that elevator. I think I jumped out before we got to the basement, before the crash finally landed. But I naively assumed that if people claim to be Christian, then their business and their life exudes their Christian belief and philosophy. And sadly, on 2 occasions, I've worked with Christian people whose faith was one thing on Sunday, and it was completely different by the time we hit the marketplace on a Monday. And I could never reconcile it. You can believe one thing and do the opposite. So that's, to me, and my faith keeps bringing me back to center me and to help me recognize that God is everything, that I am nothing, that he is my provider. It's not my employer who's my provider. It's not the people who supported us financially while we were with OM was my provider. It's not the business I ran, the property developments I did that provided for me. When we recognize that God is our provider, and he will do it sometimes through a business, sometimes through a gift, sometimes through a maiden aunt in New Zealand, sometimes through an employer, then you realize that God's our provider. And so I've sought to live my life based on the fact that what I believe and how I live actually tie together and form a complete package.
Wow, there's a huge lesson there, Richard, in the wisdom download, which is that what you believe and how you live are tied together. And I'm going to ask you about the wisdom you gained in life, Richard. But before I do, many people may know you as Richard from the Entrust Foundation. Correct. Tell us a little bit about the Entrust Foundation.
I'd love to. A fellow called Eugene Veith was a businessman. He had a bad stutter and he had no hair when he was 22. And he said, "I'm good for nothing. I'm a no-hoper." And he was faithful, godly man. And his father went broke in a butcher's shop. And all that was left from the business was a broken down Austin 7 van with no front door. And Eugene, who had this bad stutter and no hair, people felt sorry for me. He said, and they'd say, "Eugene, could you move some parcels from there and take them across town, deliver them over there?" And he said, I just did it and tried to be faithful. And he said, "God bless me." And he said, "My stutter started to disappear and I grew a little bit of self-confidence and God just blessed me." So roll the clock forward 35 years. Eugene Veith now has the largest parcel delivery business in Melbourne. And he's got a state-of-the-art warehouse. And his business was bought by one of the major companies in Australia because Eugene, over those 35 years, had taken all their customers, and the only way to get their customers back was to buy the business off Eugene. So he put that money into a trust. He didn't take any of it for himself. Put the money into a trust, invested the money, and just used to write checks and give away the income from the trust.
Oh.
So I joined his board after I left OM in 2001 or 2. And one day he asked me to go to his nursing home where he was living. And he said, "Richard," he said, "I've just turned 90. He said, I'm getting a bit old for this." He said, "If I paid you 2 days a week, would only be a basic wage, nothing fancy." He said, "Would you like to come and work for me And then when people come knocking on my door and want money, I can send them to see you. They'll stop bothering me. So
Yes.
So that was my friend Eugene. I'd known him for a number of years, loved him like a dad. And how could you say no to an offer like that? So I've been on this board. I started working for Eugene 2 days a week. And people came knocking on my door saying, can we have money for this? And can we have money for that? And I had this radar that was quite sensitive. And someone wanted the money for the wrong reason. My radar would say, Richard, no, that's probably not the best way to spend that money. So
Yes.
I use my relational skills to develop a number of connections. And then in 2008, we decided that we should change the way we operated. Instead of giving away the money that this foundation earned, we said, let's use it to pay some overheads, to pay our costs for running this organization, because there are more people who want to give but don't know where to give, and they don't know who to trust. So we changed our model. So we used the income from Eugene's business to pay for the running costs. And I was just doing some stats this afternoon. In the last 13 years since we started Entrust, by God's grace, we've paid all our overheads out of our own pockets, and we've distributed over 12 million Australian dollars to 637 projects in 15 or 20 different countries. And we've seen people come to faith. We've seen churches planted. We've seen people baptized. We've seen lives changed. We've seen the poorest of the poor given a fresh chance for a start in life. And we only work with Christian partners. So I've got a small team of people. And we have about 60 projects on the go at any one time. And we work in East Africa, Indian subcontinent, and right through Asia. We focus on the hard places that nobody else really knows about. We spend time in those countries. We make friends with the people who deliver our projects. And we build a trusted relationship with them. So I can put my hand on my heart and say to a donor, if you want to give 20K to build that water project in Cambodia, I can promise you I know the people that are going to spend it. I know their integrity. I've been there half a dozen times, and we will get your 20K there, and I'll send you a report about it, and we will do it at our cost. Oh, by the way, if you want to come with me next time I'm going, you're welcome. So that's the Entrust Foundation. And we're so grateful that God's given us the opportunity to provide clean water, economic empowerment for the poor, education for the world's poor, and we do what we can to combat human trafficking. So just this week,
amazing!
Just this week, we've been able to find $30,000 from a donor in Australia who's a friend of mine. We identified there was 120 girls, some as young as 14, had been trafficked from northern Vietnam through China into northern Myanmar, and our partners on the ground who are anti-trafficking experts heard about these girls. 72 of them didn't have passports because they were trafficked. So the way the Burmese government fixed it was to put them in prison. And so we've been able to raise some money to get these girls out of prison, to give them clothes, to give them some food, to give them accommodation, to give them some counselling, to show the love of Christ to them, and then repatriate them back to Vietnam after they've had some time getting their lives back together. So that's just what I've been doing in the last week. Such a privilege.
Wow, Richard. Just wow. What a wonderful work to be involved in. Yeah. We talked at length about your life and your ministry, Richard, and business, and overall this time, whether it be in your family or in the workplace or in the church and wider society, you undoubtedly have gained much wisdom. The Bible talks about wisdom being the principal thing. And right from those early days, sitting around your mother and father's dining room table discussing the Bible and theology, and then through your life and work, you've undoubtedly gained a lot of wisdom. What do you sense are the key points of wisdom you gained in life and leadership?
Well, there are so many things, but I did take a few dot points just to keep me focused. I think one of the things is unconditional love for each other, for our spouses, for our families. My youngest son Philip has had a long-term issue with drug addiction, And while we haven't condoned anything he's done, we decided that many parents would have written their kids off by the stage we got to. When I sat in the courtroom for the 23rd time within a couple of years to listen to the charges that were laid against our son, and the magistrate says, "Philip, I see your long-suffering parents are in court yet again." He said, "Do you know how fortunate you are?" He said, "I've never seen a list this long where the parents are still in court supporting their son." He said, "Because of that, I'm going to give you this suspended sentence to give you a chance for rehabilitation." And just such a privilege. To hear that from a magistrate, but also the lesson that God taught us is that we don't condone anything he did. But Jesus loved us and loves us unconditionally. And when we stuff up and when we fail, he doesn't stop loving us because we did the wrong thing. He keeps loving us regardless. And I thought, if that's what Jesus does for us, how can we do anything different for our own kids and for the people that I work with around the world? I mean, I'm friends with some of the poorest people on the entire planet, but I'm also in close relationship and close friendships with some of the wealthiest people on the planet. And I said to someone the other day, I'm just a pipe. I'm a plumber, really. I'm just got a pipeline between those that have it and those that don't. And I'm just a pipe that the money flows through. And I've spent the last 18 months of COVID trying to build a bigger pipe so we can move more money to more projects. But unconditional love is the first thing. Second thing, Tommy, is I can do nothing on my own. I have a few skills and God's given me some life experience, like I can use that. But everything I do is laid bare before God. And I try to only do what I do because God, gives me the opportunity, and it's because God directs me to do that. So without God in my life, I've got nothing. I've got nothing. Yeah. Another lesson for me is invest in your spouse, invest in your marriage. I would travel most years for most of my marriage up to 3 months of the year away from home. And that comes with its challenges. You'd also have to say when I was younger, it comes with a lot of temptations as well. And by God's grace and by being very clear about my moral compass, I've remained faithful to my wife. She's never given a day's thought to whether or not I've been faithful. And I'm so blessed to be able to say that. I'm not saying it. I'm just saying it. God's grace is what's enabled me to do that, because I made a decision when I got married that being unfaithful is never, ever going to be an option in any circumstance. And you can imagine with the amount of travel I do, there has always been opportunity and no one would ever know. Yeah. But God's kept me faithful to my wife. Traveling a lot does have a cost, a personal cost, a physical cost. I've got more microbes living in my gut on a regular basis than most people would have in 3 lifetimes. And I don't like to tell Julie that I go to some really dangerous places, but I do. And God's protected me. And I've been threatened to be stabbed, and I've had guns held at me, and I've been bunkered down in places that no one should go. But God's looked after me. I think servant leadership is a key thing. So my goal is, I'm a leader. I've got a team of 12 people I lead with Entrust. They're all part-time. Several of them are volunteers. But my job as a leader is to serve them and to equip them and to empower them and to do all that needs to be done to make them successful. It's not about me. It's not about Richard. It's not about Entrust. It's about serving the poor. And I've been able to build a culture within Entrust that we are simply servants to the people that God has called us to. And with our donors, some of them don't have a lot of friends. We're their friend. Some of them are so wealthy they can't talk about it with anybody else, but they can talk about it with us. And yes, how much money they have doesn't really make any difference to me. And I don't chase them for their money. I chase them to serve them and to help them do what they do better than I can on my own. So relationships are integral. I wrote a book about relationships. It's called Real Relationships, Managing Complex Relationships in Our World. And I wrote a book about it because I'd learned some things along the way about how to relate to people from different cultures, but how to relate to people who would seem to be above everybody else. And, I have a lot of friends internationally, and it's such a privilege. Another thing that I've learnt in life is integrity. There is no compromise around integrity. If you're not integrous in everything you do, then you've really are spinning your wheels. You're not doing anything at all. And so to take what the Bible says about telling the truth, honouring God, loving others, doing unto others as you'd have them do to you, living a life of integrity with God's help, and keeping a very short account. And I'm not putting myself up as the expert on integrity, but doing the right thing by your tax, paying what's needed to be paid, saying yes and turning up, saying I'll be there at 12 and being there at 5 to 12, not letting people down. It's basic integrity. And our credibility as Christian leaders is based on us doing what we say we're going to do. And my diary is chockers like yours, Tommy. And I have to, Tommy and I are both learning how to say no to some good things in order to make room for some great things.
Absolutely, Richard.
I had a friend who's very wealthy say to me 2 weeks ago, he said, Richard, I'd love to do some property development with you. And I said, oh, that'd be great. And I've done several myself, for half a dozen. But I said, I really haven't got time. He said, oh, don't worry, I'll put the money up. I said, no, it's not about the money. I said, I just don't, it's not my focus. My focus is to empower the poorest people on the planet and to share God's love with them. That's my focus. He said, but think what you could do with the money that we'd make. I said, I tell you what, I don't need the money. Why don't you just give me your money and I'll do what I'm doing, and you got the capacity, so let's just do this together without doing the property development. And he just laughed. He just actually laughed at me. He said, that's great. I can't argue against that. So no compromise, building trust with people. I do have the capacity to build trust with people. And I don't do it because I'm clever. I do it because I'm integrous in the way I operate. And there are people, I had a situation with this these traffic girls. We're trying to find 30 grand. We've been trying to find 20 grand to buy 2,000 Bibles for new believers in Uganda. And there was needed another 20 grand Australian dollars for an outreach program in Myanmar or Burma, which saw 220 people baptized in the last 12 months as a direct result of this outreach in Buddhist communities. So I was actually chasing $70,000. And I sent an email out to 2 or 3 friends. I had a guy call me and say, Rich, I hear you need some help. He said, do you know these people? I said, yes. He said, have you been there? I said, yes. He said, are you sure that the people who are looking after the traffic girls are legit? And I said, yep. He said, I'll send you the money. That was it. That was a 3-minute phone call. And they're doing that not because of the projects, but because of the trust they have in me to be able to sign off on the people that we know. And so building trust at every level in our lives is integral to God being able to pour his love and his outworking through each of us. The other thing I would say, Tommy, I'm probably taking too much time, but the other thing I'd say is take a long-term view. We are human beings, not human doings. And men in Christian leadership think that doing more is better than doing less. But sometimes we have to sit and we have to stop, and we have to wait on the Lord, and we have to listen to what he's got to say to us. And I have a prayer regime. I have a mentor, and he's convinced me, and I don't need to be convinced. For several years now, I have between 1 and 2 days prayer retreat every month where I take time out to put it in my diary to stop doing what I'm doing. And I go away a couple of days. I go away overnight. And it's a prayer retreat. My board said, this is part of your work life. And I seek the Lord. And I pray for our partners, and I pray for what we're doing, and I ask God to provide for what we need. And I stop and I listen, and I worship, and I read, and I listen to worship songs, and I go for walks, and it just clears my head. And so taking a long-term view of life, that God's not in a hurry. We are, but God's not. And God's plan is often different to ours. And I've also learned that God's plan is often counterintuitive. Logic would say we do 1, 2, 3. But God says, I want you to do X, Z, and W in that order. And you go, what? So when we do what God puts on our hearts to do, we never wanted to grow Entrust. We said, we think that being faithful to what God's called us to do is more important than sending more money or having more projects. But as we're wanting to grow the kingdom of God was our mantra. We're saying we just want to do whatever will grow the kingdom. And the more we're focused on growing the kingdom, the more people we've been able to help, the more trust we've been granted, the more money that's come through, the more Entrust has grown, because our core value is growing the kingdom. And that's just a couple of the lessons that God's been showing me.
Wow, Richard. The whole focus on growing the kingdom, and I know you send your investors a kingdom impact report, and
Correct.
measuring things in terms of the impact for the kingdom is so refreshing compared to measuring things because of the sake of growth. So it's interesting that you talk about these lessons you learned through life, Richard, but earlier in the conversation you talked about the teenager who was dating this girl and wanted to buy an MG car and ended up getting married to this young Julie when you were not yet 21. So I want to take you back as we finish to Richard Beaumont, the 20-year-old about to get married. And if you could tell young Richard 3 things that you've learned as the older Richard, what would you tell yourself?
That's a great question. It really is interesting because when you're 20, you think that you know everything. By the time you get to 30, you realise how little you knew when you were 20. The first thing I would say is to choose your friends wisely. We end up with the people that we hang out with. We end up like the people that we hang out with. I think it's important that we have friends who are not yet Christian, but they shouldn't be the bulk of our people, because we think that we have the capacity to influence others. But the truth is the herd mindset has a more powerful influence on us. Because when we're young, we want to conform. We want to fit in with the crowd. We want to do what the crowd want to do because we want to be seen as part of them. And this whole peer pressure thing, and driven ferociously by social media, it just is a killer of self-esteem, of direction, of focus, of faith. It just is everything we see on social media chews away at the foundation that our faith should give us. So if you hang out with a bunch of drug addicts, you'll end up a drug addict. If you hang out with a bunch of fun-loving businessmen who are out to squeeze whatever they can and get rich, you'll probably end up rich, but at huge cost. If you hang out with people who love Jesus and want to grow the kingdom and want to use their God-given gifts, that's the group you should hang with. But as I say, don't only have Christian friends. I've got many non-Christian friends, and they look to me sometimes as a level voice and someone they can go to that will give a fair but measured response from a Christian perspective. They may not always agree with me, but they at least respect my view. Second thing would be to live out what the Bible says. So many Christians read their Bible, and some of them don't. But for me, my faith has to work out in everything I do, in the way I live, in the way I manage my relationships, in the way I relate to others, and the way I run my whole life is based on my faith and my belief in what God's called us to do. So,
Absolutely.
so reading your Bible, getting to know the scriptures. I spend 20, 30 minutes every morning thinking about scripture. There's prayer times because I need that to give me the food that I need to do what I do during the day. Was it C.T. Studd said I had so much to do today, I had to spend an extra hour in prayer to get through the day. And there's not many of us can say that. I can't say that. I don't spend an extra hour in prayer to get through my day. And I think the other thing I already mentioned is that we are human beings, not human doings. And men especially, I'm sure there's some women listen to this. Women go into things relationally, and it's a major generalization, so please forgive me, ladies and men. Women go into things with their heart and are relational, whereas men think that by ticking boxes and doing stuff and getting through our to-do list, yep, done that, fix that, change that, that we're achieving stuff. And what I've learned with family, what I've learned with our overseas partners, I travel, and people think I've got the best job in the world. I travel to go overseas to meet with my friends and take them out for dinner and to see how I can minister to them and love them and encourage them and mentor them and be a pastor to them and to hold them accountable for the funds we've sent to them. And they go, it doesn't get better than that. So, well, actually, you know what? It's hard work. I did 52 flights in 2019, and that's hard going by anyone's standard. So men, don't just tick off a to-do list. Take some time to say, God, what do you want me to do today? What do you want me to stop doing today so that I've got room for the thing that you really want me to do? We, at the beginning of COVID, my son's a chef, and we have a friend who's a celebrity chef in Melbourne, and they were both dissatisfied with their present employer. And so me and another business friend got together and said, we're going to open a restaurant, and we're going to put Pierre and Matthew as the chefs in this restaurant. I don't really want a restaurant. Right. It's the last thing on my list. I haven't got time for a restaurant. But with these two guys running the restaurant, it would have been a very successful restaurant. And I went in with a business friend, and we'd raised the money. And I'm all the time saying, Lord, if this is not of you, please stop it. Please stop it. I don't want to go into this if this is not what you have for us. I don't need the pain. And if this is what you want, I'll do it. But if it's not what you want, please put a brake on it. One day before we signed the lease, there was a slight glitch in the business arrangement with the senior chef. And we just felt that wasn't right to proceed. We didn't sign a 3-year lease on a restaurant in Melbourne. And 3 weeks later, COVID broke out. And most restaurants in Melbourne have been shut down for 18 months. God saved us at the 11th hour because I was open and submitted to what he wanted. Now, it could have been that I went ahead and God taught me some very hard lessons. But I really wanted to submit myself to God's will and not drive my own agenda. So human beings, not human doings. Choose your friends wisely and live what the Bible tells us to do and be Christians in our faith 24/7 in every circumstance.
Wow. Richard, we chatted for almost 45 minutes.
Oh my goodness.
the wisdom that Richard Beaumont has gained over many years of life and ministry. I should say to our listeners on the podcast that you have a book called Real Relationships and available on Amazon and I'm sure available on all outlets. Also, Richard, you talked about the Entrust Foundation, and I think people can find that online at entrust.org.au and or something of that nature.
No, that's correct.
And Richard, thank you for joining us today. It almost feels like we need a part 2 with Richard Beaumont to really do justice to this podcast. But we're very grateful, Richard, to you for your time, for your wisdom, for your honesty, for your vulnerability, and for all you shared with us today. Until the next time, folks, on the Wisdom Download, that's us. God bless.